I think most importantly, even though the peace accords gave indigenous peoples the right to reconstitute communal lands, as this project was executed, no communities were ever given the opportunity to make choices other than the private titling that they had been channeled into during the Civil War, and in a context of which anything communal was considered subversive and cause for extrajudicial assassination, really, in Guatemala. Even recently, most communities kind of accepted the private titles that were being pushed by the land technicians. In a few cases, communities did ask to conserve a community forest or a sacred site, but they were always told by project technicians that the title has to be in someone's name and that it wasn't possible. And I want to take a minute here to talk about what in Kekchi indigenous governance looks like, because I think that there's a lot of misunderstandings and misperceptions of indigenous land governance as communist, anarchic, ecological tragedy, per Garrett Hardin. And so I just want to show you a few maps of what that looks like and the ecological and social logics embedded in that land use. So if we were to take a lowland Kekchi community, the soils would be very variable. You might have a mountain area in which farming would be not viable, areas better suited for firewood, forestry, a lot of swampy areas, and then a limited number, less than probably 20% of soils that can be appropriately used for agriculture. So under a customary system of community land governance, there would be a mix of usufruct uses of the land. The land is for those who farm it. So this is taken from a real community in which, in this case, they had divided up the land along the riverside in fairly equal plots, but the most rich land that were heritable, right, in terms of the internal governance of the community. Rotating swidden plots, reserved spaces near the community for female-headed households, elders, room for a soccer field, and then a reserve for children and areas for firewood collection. In this case, they had an opportunity for a fair trade cacao project, and were actually seeking tenure security, 1-acre parcels within the community. And we often think about tenure security from the Western perspective as the total size of the parcel, but for small farmers in the tropics, what really matters is access to multiple ecological niches for real food security, and not the overall amount of land. So bring a cadaster in, title this, you have a very unequal distribution of land that doesn't make a lot of ecological sense when you checkerboard the landscape in this way. And so the typical land sale pattern, farmers who have plots along roadsides and riversides are targeted first by ranchers for land sales. You know, this poor guy who got a swampy plot is going to sell because he can't make a living there, nor in the mountain areas. And increasingly those who are trying to hold on to their land find themselves surrounded by barbed wire fences, and they can't physically make their way to the plots because no right-of-way was designated in the cadaster. And I think even if communities aren't given an opportunity to do this kind of land use planning, which is quite easy to do with the GIS technology available today, communities can do this own mapping themselves. At a minimal level, sacred places should have been protected in the first phase of the project and in the second phase, according to the peace accords. In Kekchi communities, almost every village will have a sacred place. It may be a cave, a boulder, a spring, a church site sometimes, a mountaintop, but they're usually fairly secluded forested areas. And I want to give some images because I feel like I've been talking about these issues till I'm blue in the face. Because the national safeguards and the way that project management in the second phase of the project has created a process for legalizing a limited number of sacred areas is based on a pattern of spiritual sites in the Western Highlands, but for reasons that date back to the colonial period, This region was under the control of the Dominican Church. It's separated from the western highlands of Guatemala by the Cuchumatanes mountain range. They don't have access to the Pan American Highway. And so Quechua spiritual practices are quite different than in other regions of Guatemala. They're very egalitarian. They're led by a council of 4 elders. Each community has their own sacred place that will have been brought to them in a dream. Even in lowland places where they migrate into, they claim a sacred place. Versus the Western Highlands, in which ceremonies are led by professional spiritual guides who are often paid. They are born into that role. They practice ceremonies on altars, archaeological sites, and much more public spaces. Very different. I mean, you can just see the contrast in between the kinds of sites I'm talking about and the sites that the state recognizes, or the Archaeological Institute recognizes as being quote-unquote sacred sites. So indeed, in the environmental impacts assessment, there was a random list of 19 archaeological sites and a couple of mountaintops drawn up, most of the names misspelled. And this is what the project is continuing to use as its list of sacred sites in Quechua area. There should be 200, 300 sites, not 19. And that loss of sacred sites has deep consequence for community cohesion and indigenous identity. As a result of pressure, in theory, the cadastral registry is supposed to ask when it arrives to communities, do sacred sites exist in your community? Yes, no, I don't know. How many, what are they called, and where are they located? And I can guarantee you no communities are going to reveal their sacred sites to this instrument for fear that the state will turn them into archaeological sites and forbid them passage. There are other things I could speak about, but I think my time is running to a close. Lest we give up Peten, I think to just, oh well, it's done, it's over, the project's closed, it's a shame, we move on with our careers. There are some concrete steps that I think should be taken, that the bank should take responsibility for. First, to allow some communities in Peten are wanting to reconstitute, even though they have private parcels, some form of community governance as a protection against land sales, so that it will be prohibited by the community to sell land to an outsider without the consent of the entire village governance structure. Second, to provide legal support to those hundreds of communities who lost their sacred areas in the process of land allotment. And at the very least, I think to give all of the communities who participated a copy of their map. And for some reason, the bank could not find money in the budget for that courtesy. In the second phase of the project, indigenous groups, here I'm passing a message to you, are calling for a moratorium on all current and future land administration projects, including a rumored phase 3 and 4. That we don't know if it's in the works or not. Phase 2 was negotiated in secret. To allow for time and reflection and informed consent, during which you could create a better inventory, work with elder councils. There are ways in which you can use this kind of mapping to reinforce ecological goals, community development goals. But that takes, I think that takes a real consultative process that takes seriously the self-mobilization of communities instead of the theatrical, if not manipulative processes, I think, that currently constitute participation and indigenous safeguards. I want to thank the bank for commissioning this research. We have a lot of studies, and I think that there's time to do something about our findings.